This video is about multi-criteria decision making, and in particular the most popular and probably simplest way of implementing it, which we call the weighted additive model. Now, we looked in our first week in lecture 1 at the pure rational choice procedure for making decisions, and I pointed out that that's an ideal that we can almost never actually realize, and in real decision-making situations we suffer from what's called bounded rationality. We don't have the ability to identify and consider everything that we would need to take into account in a decision, and we don't have the memory and processing ability to process it even if we could. So what we do is we make compromises and we adapt. This process generally technically is called satisficing, and the idea really is the aim is to make the best decision you can, subject to the constraints of your resources and abilities. So multi-criteria decision making is probably the most common way of formally making decisions with those objectives in mind. So what we do, there's a number of adaptations, and I'll just run through them quickly. So the first one is, instead of considering every possible alternative that we could decide, we go through some process of triaging and narrowing down the set of alternatives. The second thing is we only consider some of the consequences of the decision. There can be many, many consequences to a decision, but we only consider the ones that we can reasonably identify and make judgments about, and that we think are important or most important. And similarly with preferences. So preferences are often quite complex, and you have to take into account not just the preferences of the decision maker, but of other stakeholders as well. And then there's the decision rule. In real life, decision rules can get really complicated if you try and make them, try and approach perfection with them. So what we often do is we fall back to some kind of decision rule that's fairly straightforward and easy to understand. So let's have a look at an actual multi-criteria decision matrix. I've put this spreadsheet on Wattle, so you can have a look at it and play around with it and see how it works, but I'll give you a quick run through now. So the scenario here is a company that wants to invest in some projects over the next year, and it has some objectives, and it wants to choose some number, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 projects, depending on its resources, that are the best choices. This is a very common scenario in which multi-criteria decision making is used. So what you have in the columns here is you have a column for each of the alternatives for the decision. Now, the important thing to realize is that in most situations, the alternatives that are in the columns in a decision matrix like this have been arrived at through some kind of triage process. So this company may have had 100 possible projects it could invest in. There's been some process which could get quite political, depending on the nature of the organisation, that has led to just 5 finding their way into the decision matrix. Okay, so typically, especially in large companies, you can have lots of people promoting their preferred projects, and some process goes on to narrow down the ones that are under consideration, the ones that actually go into the decision matrix. And sometimes that's a really good process. Sometimes it can be not so good. Sometimes things will end up in the decision matrix, even though most people involved in the decision making know that they're not very good and they're not going to succeed, but they go in there because maybe a friend of the CEO has been pushing them or something, or they're a pet project of a board member. That's just the reality. So So that's the columns. And then we have here in the rows, we have what are described as objectives. Now, the objectives are you can think of these as the preferences described in terms that relate to consequences. So one preference, the strongest preference, or one preference criterion here is supports business strategy. And then the second strongest one is profit, and so on. We don't need to worry too much about what these mean. What we see in this next column, the one that's headed up weight, this is a rating of the strength of preference for each of these perceived objectives or outcomes. Now, the final thing you have here in the main matrix is you have the ratings. So what goes on here is there's some process to select the set of objectives here. And again, this can be a political process. I've been involved in decisions where, in job selection decisions, where a member of a committee has tried to change the objectives or change, in job selection we call them selection criteria, has tried to change them or tried to change the weighting because they've begun to realise during the process that their preferred candidate is not going to win, and so they try and influence things by changing these. We have these weights that are given to these objectives, and the assignment of weights is something that can also become a bit political in a decision-making process. And then finally we have for each project and each objective here we have a rating, and those ratings have to come from somewhere. In a simple situation it might just be a single decision maker who sits down and works out his or her weights for the objectives and then rates each project on some scale, and it's done. There are other situations where you have multiple decision makers, so a job selection committee is a good example. There's usually at least 3 people on those committees, and so they may either be they may go into the process being told by the HR department what the objectives, the selection criteria, and the weights are, or not uncommonly they work that they'll go in knowing what the objectives are, but they work out the weights themselves. And then you have some kind of rating process, which is typically it's a kind of average of the ratings given by the individual members of the committee. So they're the main components. And then what you do is a calculation. So the way the calculation works is for each project here, each alternative, we multiply the weight for an objective by the rating that the project gets for that objective, and we just keep repeating that and we add them all up. I'll show this to you. This is what it looks like under the hood in the spreadsheet, and it might, I think, make it clearer for some of you. Just let me, we're going to look at project 2 here. So what's happening in this rating column here is for project 2, its rating of 26 there is being multiplied by the weight of 23%, 0.23, and then added to its rating for the second objective, 26, by 0.16, which is the weight, and then the weight of 0.19 is multiplied by the rating on the third criterion, and so on. So they're all just added up, and that gives us a set of scores. Okay, so you end up with an aggregated score for each project, and then the decision rule depends on the circumstances. If it's just one has to be chosen, usually it'll be the highest ranked. if it's more than one, then you'd go down the list. So you'd choose project 5 and then project 2 and then project 3 and so on. It's probably not a good idea just to rely on rankings. It's probably worth looking at the ratings as well, because they can be very close. So for example, 3 and 4 are very close, 14.0 and 14.1. That's a trivial difference, to be honest, in this situation. Okay, so just going back now to this. So a couple of things to note. There are some things you can do to help make this work well, apart from it just doing a good job of the process of selecting the alternatives and criteria and weights and so on. So one thing is these objectives, they should be, as far as possible, mutually exclusive. In other words, they don't overlap. Now, in this case, I wouldn't say that that's really been achieved terribly well. So when you look at these, you've got supports business strategy, profit, and something about competition and market gap. Well, I'm not going to give you a lecture on strategy, but some of the main things that you take into account in a business strategy are profit, market gaps, and competition. So to some extent, those objectives overlap. In many cases, it's not possible to completely avoid overlaps in the objectives, but you should try and frame them in a way that minimises it. So that's one thing you can do. Second thing is do the best job you can with the measurement. So this is something that we will explore a bit in the coming weeks. How exactly do you work out what these weights are? So quite commonly, they will just be made up by somebody, or they might be made up by a committee that, maybe individually comes up with their weights and they average them or something like that. It's often a bit of a sloppy process. There are ways of doing it that are much better that we'll learn about. And the same is true of these ratings. So the ratings can be fairly, how can I put it, arbitrary and inconsistent, and that's going to adversely affect the decision process. Different people will have different approaches to rating, and that can have an effect as well. You'll see here that both the weightings, they add up to 100%, or 1, they add up to 1, and the ratings here all add up to 100. This is generally a fairly good way of going about this if you're using the simple model. So you just say to people, look, when you're working out the weightings, you just say, look, we've got 100% to distribute between the objectives. Let's do it that way. And with the ratings, you can say to people, you've got 100 points and you need to distribute them as you see fit on the objectives to each project. If you don't do that, there's a bit of mathematics you can do to have that effect afterwards, and we'll get to that later on. Okay. One other thing about these objectives. These percentages, of course, have to add up to 100, but it's also worth remembering that if you find yourself deciding that some objective deserves a weighting of 0, then that's pretty pointless, because that means you have no preference for that objective. It's not contributing anything to your decision, so you wouldn't do that. All right, that's, I think, I've done, just here in the notes, I've done the actual calculation for project 2 that I've just shown you. It's just a simple matter of multiplying and adding, so the actual arithmetic behind it is not complicated at all. All right, thank you.